The legionary stands still. Around him, the cohort roars, cheers, stomping boots, sounds that should feel like triumph. They feel like soil hitting a coffin lid. 10 years on the frontier. He has marched through the pine forests of Germania. He has tasted the dust of Syria. Now the legate steps forward. His shadow swallows the packed earth at the soldier's feet. No gold, no oak crown, no medallion for valor. The general holds a stick, a length of grapevine wood, worn smooth by older hands, the vites. It passes into the soldier's grip, and something cold runs up his arm. The stick feels heavier than the pilum he has carried for a decade, colder than a Rhine winter. This is not command. This is a death sentence, dressed as honor. In the most disciplined war machine the ancient world ever built, why did the first rung of the ladder drop a man into hell? Why did a veteran who charged screaming Celts at Alesia, who stood firm against Parthian lances, feel his stomach turn at the word promotion? This was the paradox buried inside the Roman legions. The stories we inherit talk of glory, of honor, of the centurions, the iron spine of Rome. The truth was darker. Forget glory. This was a verdict. This is the story of how Rome took its finest men and broke them on purpose. Behind the silvered helmet, behind the crest turned sideways so every enemy could find him in the crush. A history written in the blood of his own men, and in the dread he carried in his own chest. You will see how the legions forged their officers into something less than human, then painted a target between their shoulder blades and shoved them toward the enemy's spear points. You will understand why thousands of legionaries prayed to stay invisible, to serve their 20 years, to vanish back into a farm in Campania and be forgotten. They knew to be chosen was to be marked for death. Tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. And if you believe these buried stories deserve to be told, take a second and subscribe. It's the only way this channel keeps breathing. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The transformation does not begin with a shout. It begins with silence. The first night after his promotion, the new centurion walks toward the fire he has known for a decade. 8 men sit around it, his contubernum. The men he marched beside through pine and sand, the men who shared his last crust of bread on the road to Mogontiacum, the men who pissed beside him in the snow on the night the chatty almost overran the picket. He steps into the firelight. The laughter stops mid-breath. A joke dies in someone's throat. One of them, a Gaul named Tertius in the old days, the man who once stitched a gash in his thigh with horsetail thread under torchlight in a turf hut, looks up and does not smile. None of them smile. 8 pairs of eyes meet his. They are not the eyes of friends. They are the eyes of men measuring a stranger, calculating, wary. The kind of look a slave gives a new master on the first morning. They shift to make room for him. A gap opens by the flames. It might as well be a ravine. He sits. The fire crackles. Pine resin pops in the embers. No one speaks. The warmth does not reach him. This is the first execution. Not of a body, of a brotherhood. And the army knew exactly what it was doing when it killed him this way. Rome had learned, over centuries of trial paid in spilled blood, that a commander cannot share a bowl of barley porridge with the men he must flog at dawn. He cannot laugh at a joke about the tribune one night and order a man's tongue cut out the next morning. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC after a lifetime studying the legions from inside the household of Scipio Aemilianus, recorded the iron rule plainly. The centurion was chosen not for dash or bravado, but for the cold steadiness of a man who would hold his ground when everything around him broke. Polybius called them men who would die at their post rather than abandon it. To bind a legion together, you must first tear something apart. So the system reached into the soldier's life and ripped out every friendship by the root. The jokes he once told became sedition. The complaints he once nodded at became mutiny. He ate alone. He slept alone in his own tent at the head of the century's row, separated by canvas and rank from the men whose snoring used to lull him to sleep. His existence narrowed to a single function. He was the edge of Roman order, and an edge cannot embrace what it must cut. The men he had bled beside in Germania, the men who had carried him 3 miles through frozen mud with a swaby arrow in his shoulder, those men would feel his stick across their backs by the end of the week. For a sandal strap left loose, for a half-second of hesitation in the testudo drill, for nothing at all if he was in a foul mood and a tribune happened to be watching from the rampart. He had to become feared. Love was a luxury. Fear was a budget item. His new weapon was not the gladius. It was the stick in his hand, the vitis, a length of grapevine, hard as bone after years of curing in the smoke of the camp ovens, light enough to swing all day, heavy enough to crack a collarbone. From the first gray light of dawn until the trumpets sounded the watch, he walked the lines. On the march, 60 pounds of gear on every man's back. Lorica hamata, helmet, 2 pila, scutum, 3 days of grain, a saw, a pickaxe, a cooking pot for the contubernium, 2 wooden stakes for the night's camp. He prowled beside the column with the vitis in his fist, 20 Roman miles before sundown. In high summer on the road from Carnuntum to Vindobona, with the Pannonian dust caking in a man's teeth, that pace killed weaker recruits before any enemy got near them. A man stumbled in the dust. The stick cracked across his shoulders. A man let his line drift by half a pace. The stick bit into the back of his neck. A man coughed too loud during a halt. The stick found his ribs. The centurion was not following an order anymore. He was the order. Every blow was his choice. He saw the hatred jump into the eyes of a soldier he had once trusted with his life. He felt the dull thud of seasoned wood meeting muscle. He heard the grunt, the wet exhale, the shuffle of feet as the column kept moving because to stop was worse than to be hit. And he did it again, and again, and again. The legion ran on reflex, a reflex beaten into 80 men until they no longer thought, only moved. And he was the man who did the beating. The blacksmith hammering meat into iron. He could refuse, in theory. He could try to hold on to whatever scrap of the old self still lived behind his eyes. But the optio beside him wanted his rank and his pay. 5 times the wage of a common legionary by the time of Domitian, with a share of every triumph donative on top. The first spear of the cohort, the primus pilus, was watching for weakness. That man had clawed his way up from the same ranks and remembered every name he had stepped on. A tribune from a senatorial family in Rome would arrive next month for an inspection in a polished cuirass he had never sweated in, and he would ask why this century's drill was a half-beat slow. A century that drilled soft would die in formation, and a centurion whose men died in formation was not pitied. He was tried. The lightest sentence was demotion and a public flogging in front of the eagles. The heaviest was the same death he would soon learn to deliver to others. There was no room, no air, no mercy in the structure. so he swung the vitis. He became the man his soldiers cursed under their breath in the dark. He became something that ate, slept, and breathed in the shape of a man, but had no friends inside the camp walls. Tacitus preserved the name of one such centurion. He served in the legions stationed in Pannonia in AD 14 on the slow gray rivers of the Middle Danube in the first weeks after the death of Augustus. His name was Lucilius. His men gave him a nickname, and the nickname stuck so hard it crossed 2,000 years. Cedo alterum. Give me another. It was what he bellowed all day long, because he broke his vine stick on his soldiers' backs faster than the camp carpenters could cut new ones. One staff would shatter against a spine. He would roar for a fresh one. He would resume the beating where he left off, the new wood biting into the same raw welts. Tacitus tells us how Lucilius died. When the news of Augustus's death reached the camp at Nauportus, the legions of Pannonia mutinied. 3 legions, the 8th, the 9th, and the 15th Apollinaris, turned on their officers. They had served past their 20 years. They had been promised land and given swamp. A common soldier named Persenius, a former actor who knew how to work a crowd, climbed onto a pile of turf and shouted what every man was thinking. The camp became a forge of rage, and the first man the soldiers came looking for was Lucilius. They dragged him into the parade ground and beat him to death with the same kind of stick he had broken on their backs. No trial, no appeal. 16 years of his rage paid back in one afternoon. Lucilius was not a freak. Lucilius was the design. Every new centurion was expected to bend toward that shape, and every new centurion knew, somewhere behind his eyes, how Lucilius had ended. But the daily beatings were a small thing. The centurion had not yet been asked for the true price. That came on a morning when the tribune's slave found him at the latrines and told him he was summoned. A boy from his century, 18, from a hill town in Hispania Tarraconensis, recruited only last spring, still half a child, had been found asleep at his post on the second watch. The sentence was written into the laws of the legion 3 centuries before this centurion was born. Polybius described it in detail, because even to a Greek observer raised on the wars of Alexander, the procedure was something worth recording with care. The fustuarium. At dawn, the entire legion formed up on the parade ground, 5,000 men in silence. The condemned boy was led to the center, stripped of his armor, his tunic torn open at the chest. He shook. He could not stop shaking. The centurion stood at the front of his century. He had to look at the boy. He had to read the charge aloud in a voice that did not crack. Sleeping on watch in the face of the enemy. Endangering the camp. Endangering the eagle. Then the tribune did what the law required. He walked forward, took up a cudgel, and lightly touched the condemned man with it. That touch was the signal. Polybius records it with the flat precision of a man describing a butcher's cut. After that touch, the boy was no longer a soldier. He was no longer a citizen. He was prey. The centurion gave the order. The boy's own tent mates stepped out of the formation. The 7 men who shared his bread, who knew the name of his mother in Tarraco, who had drawn lots with him for the worst sentry hour the night before. They carried clubs and rounded river stones placed in the center of the ground for this purpose. The centurion did not look away. He was forbidden to look away. He had to stand witness, the law made flesh, until the body was still. The first stone struck the boy's temple. A wet sound, sharp and small. His knees folded. A club came down on his shoulder. Another on his back. Another on his face. The legionaries fell on him in a knot of swinging arms, and the sound was not the sound of execution. It was the sound of butchery in a market stall. They did not kill him cleanly. They could not. The horror was the point. Some swung wildly to end it fast, to spare him. Some swung with the rage of men who knew they could just as easily have been the one in the dust. By the time it was over, the shape on the ground was no longer a boy from Hispania. It was meat and broken bone, and a smear that the camp slaves would scrub from the dirt with vinegar. Polybius adds a detail the modern ear forgets. Even if a man somehow survived the beating, bloody, blind, his ribs hanging open, he was not allowed to return home. He could not enter his city of birth. His own father was forbidden by law to take him in. He became a ghost, wandering the edges of the empire until hunger or fever finished what the clubs had begun. The centurion had given the order. The centurion had turned 7 friends into 7 killers. He had taken a contubernium that ate from the same pot and made them tear one of their own to pieces with their hands. This was discipline. This was the Roman way. He felt nothing on his face. He could not afford to, and the fustuarium was not even the worst. Rome kept a deeper weapon in the locked chest at the back of its mind. A word that should never have been written down. Decimatio, the removal of a tenth. It was the answer to mass cowardice. If a cohort broke before a Dacian charge. If a century threw down its shields and ran from Parthian arrows on the burning plain near Carrhae. If an entire legion lost its eagle, the worst sin a Roman unit could commit, then the legate had one tool left, and he would use it. Crassus used it. Plutarch tells the story in his Life of the Triumvir. In 71 BC, during the war against Spartacus, one of Crassus's lieutenants threw 500 men against the rebels without orders. The line broke. Crassus ordered the survivors paraded and the lots drawn, and Plutarch records the result without ornament. 500 men, 50 beaten to death in front of the rest. Plutarch notes that the punishment had not been seen in the Roman army for a long time, and that the soldiers feared their own commander more than the slaves they had been sent to kill. That was the point. Cassius Dio describes another use of the same weapon a generation later, by Mark Antony in Armenia. And Tacitus tells us of L. Apronius in Africa, who decimated an entire cohort that had fled before Numidian raiders in AD 20. Even under the emperors, when the legions had become a professional standing army with pensions and brick barracks and tile roofs, the old terror was kept on the shelf, dusted off whenever a Senate-bred legate decided the men under him needed reminding. The shamed unit was disarmed, isolated, ringed by other legions who watched with the cold curiosity of men glad it was not their day. The centurion would be summoned to the praetorium, the legate's tent at the heart of the camp, the smell of beeswax and parchment, the silence of men too senior to raise their voices, and told in a flat voice that his century had been chosen. He had to walk back to his 80 men. He had to tell them. He oversaw the lots himself. A bronze helmet, upturned, 80 smooth stones dropped inside, 72 pale, 8 dark as iron. He walked the line. His men stood in a single rank, faces drained of color, sweat running down their temples in the cold morning air. Each man reached into the helmet. Each man closed his fist around a stone he could not yet see. None of them looked at it. None of them dared. When the last man had drawn, the centurion gave the order. "Open your hands." A sound rose from the line, not a shout, a noise without a name. Some men sobbed with relief so violent their legs gave out. Others stared down at the dark stone in their palm and did not move at all. 8 men, marked by a pebble. There was no trial, no appeal, no prayer accepted. The 72 who held the pale stones were handed clubs. Their officers ordered them forward. They beat the 8 chosen men to death in front of the entire legion, while the centurion watched and counted breaths and made sure the law was satisfied. The survivors of a decimation were not allowed back into the safety of the main camp afterward. Polybius is clear on this point. They were quartered outside the rampart, in the open ground beyond the ditch, where any night raider could find them first. They were issued rations of barley instead of wheat, animal feed, the grain of slaves. They slept on the wet earth. They lived as the dead, half inside the world and half already out of it, until their commander judged that they had earned the right to be men again. Read what that moment did to a man. The centurion was not just an executioner that morning. He was the architect of his own century's ruin. He had stood over a lottery that turned brothers into murderers. He had forced the shield wall to cannibalize itself. The bonds of trust that hold a fighting unit together. Rome shattered them on purpose, with a stone and a club, in front of 5,000 witnesses, so the lesson would never fade. The message carved itself into every survivor. The legion is greater than your friends. The eagle is greater than your life. The man beside you in the shield wall is not your brother. He is a tool of Rome, and so are you. And tools that fail are discarded. The men who lived through a decimation did not return to duty relieved. They returned hollow. They flinched at the sound of their own centurion's voice. They looked at him not as a leader but as a keeper, a jailer in a silvered helmet. For the centurion, this was the last stage of his making. Cut off from his old friends, taught to swing the stick 1,000 times a day, forced to preside over the murder of one boy from Tarraco, and then over the murder of 8 more chosen by lottery from the men he had trained. He had become what Rome needed him to become. The transverse crest on his helmet, horsehair dyed red or black, set sideways across the bowl so every soldier in the formation could find him at a glance through the chaos of dust and shouting, was no longer a mark of honor. It was a warning. That man over there is the one who will read your sentence. That man over there is the one who will not blink. He had traded a soul for a rank. He had been paid in authority and stained in the blood of his own. The men in our community, the lineage, understand that history is not a polite collection of statues and dates. It is a record of what human beings have done to each other when the system gave them permission. If that truth matters to you, if you believe these stories deserve to be dragged into the light and looked at without flinching, then I invite you to stand with us. Becoming a member of the lineage means you stop being only a viewer. You become part of the work. You fund the deep research, the long hours, the production that turns forgotten brutality into something the world can finally see. In return, you get early access to investigations and exclusive material the public never touches. Help us keep this mission alive. Join the lineage. The link is in the description below. But everything you have just heard was only the first half of his sentence. Rome built him to break men on the parade ground. That was the smaller cruelty. The larger one waited for him on the battlefield, where the same system that taught him to swing the vitis had already decided how he would die, and made certain the enemy would know exactly which man to kill first. The crest on his helmet was not for his glory. It was a target painted in horsehair. And on the day the trumpets called for the charge, every barbarian spear in the front rank would be looking for it. The horror inside the camp forged him into something the legion could use. And Rome never used a tool for only one purpose. The same training that turned him into a monster to his own soldiers had a second function. It made him visible, painted, marked from 1,000 paces. Picture yourself in a Cherushi war band on a damp September morning in the year AD 9, in the broken country east of the Rhine that the Romans called the Saltus Teutoburgiensis. Modern archaeology places the killing ground near Kalkries in Lower Saxony, where excavators have pulled hundreds of lead sling bullets, iron sandal nails, and the cheek pieces of Roman cavalry helmets from a low pass between a wooded ridge and a peat bog. The fog clings to the oaks. Water beads on every leaf. Your breath comes out white. You crouch with 2,000 other men behind a low rampart of cut turf and woven branches that the Romans, marching past in column, cannot yet see. The rampart is 6 feet high. It runs for nearly half a mile along the slope. Arminius spent the summer building it under cover of friendship with the very man he was about to kill. You hear them before you see them. The crunch of hobnailed caligae on wet leaves, the chink of a loose strap buckle, a cough quickly bitten off. 3 legions, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, strung out over 15 miles of forest track with their families, their wagons, their pack mules, their slaves. Then the first rank emerges from the mist. A wall. Curved scuta painted red and yellow with the lightning bolt of Legio 17th. Bowl-shaped iron helmets, identical, anonymous. 5,000 men in the lead column alone, shaped into one body. You cannot tell one from the next. You cannot pick a face to hate, except for one. His helmet has a ridge across the top, not front to back. Horsehair dyed with madder root runs sideways above the crown. He carries no big shield. He paces beside the column with a vine stick in his right fist. He does not march in line. He moves. Your chieftain, perhaps Arminius's own brother-in-law Segimer, raised in a longhouse on the upper Lipa, points his Francisca and screams a name into the fog. Every spear in your line locks onto the crest. Kill him, and the body has no head. Kill him, and the wall breaks. He is not an officer in your eyes. He is a coin nailed to a post, and you are the boy with the sling. 3 days later, when Quintilius Varus fell on his own sword to avoid capture, the legions he commanded had ceased to exist. Suetonius records that the Emperor Augustus, 60 years later in his palace on the Palatine, would still wake from sleep beating his head against the doorpost and crying out, Quintili Vera, legiones reda. Varus, give me back my legions. Of the centurions who marched into that forest, almost none came out. The ones taken alive were nailed to oak trees in the Cherushi groves, their tongues cut out, their skulls fixed to the trunks as offerings to Woden. Tacitus describes the scene 6 years later when Germanicus returned with a Roman army to bury the bones. Whitened skulls fastened to tree trunks, altars in the clearings where the senior officers had been butchered. The centurion's place in the battle order was not a privilege. It was an equation, written by men who had buried a great many centurions and decided the math was acceptable. The primus pilus, the first spear, the senior centurion of the entire legion, and every centurion in the front line stood on the extreme right end of his formation. Vegetius, writing his summary of Roman military practice in the late 4th century AD from older manuals now lost, confirms the placement without comment, as if no other arrangement were thinkable. The right was the kill side. Roman legionaries carried the scutum on the left arm and the gladius in the right. Across the entire front, as men closed with the enemy, each soldier drifted half a step toward the protection of the shield of the man on his right. The line tilted. The rightmost man had no neighbor. His shield covered his own chest and nothing else. His right side, sword arm, ribs, hip, neck, was bare air. That was where the centurion stood, the crest above his helmet, the vine stick discarded, a small round parma in his left hand instead of the heavy scutum, because at this position he had to swing freely. Greaves of polished bronze on his shins where the common soldier wore none, a visible privilege that was also a visible target. He was the anchor of the line. The post the entire formation pivoted around, the single point of flesh that absorbed the first shock of every charge. Thucydides had already described the same rightward drift in Greek hoplite warfare 4 centuries before Caesar in his account of the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC. The Romans inherited the geometry. They simply chose to plant their best officers at the place they knew would die first. The numbers are not estimates. Caesar counted his dead by name. At Pharsalus, on the 9th of August, 48 BC, on the dry plain of Thessaly along the Enipeus River, he met Pompey's army in the battle that ended a republic. The morning began with the dust of 45,000 Pompeian soldiers crossing the parched stubble, the heat already shimmering off the bronze of their shields. Caesar tells us in the 3rd book of his Civil War commentary that he lost about 200 legionaries that day, a small price for a kingdom. Then he names another figure, 30 centurions, dead. Caesar's army at Pharsalus numbered about 22,000 foot. He had perhaps 350 centurions across all his legions. They were 1.5% of his force. They were 15% of his dead. A common soldier had roughly a 1 in 100 chance of dying that morning. A centurion had nearly a 1 in 10. The same Caesar describes the earlier disaster at Dyrrhachium, on the Illyrian coast in July of the same year, where Pompey's troops broke through his siege lines at the sea wall. In a single afternoon, a cohort of the 9th Legion lost every centurion in its ranks. Some were killed outright. The rest were carried back blind, javelins driven through the cheek pieces of their helmets. Caesar writes that 4 of the survivors had lost both eyes. One of them, a primus pilus named Sceva, was found later with 120 pila lodged in his shield. Caesar promoted him to the position of evocatus and paid him 200,000 sesterces from his own purse. Sceva had held a fortified outpost alone after every other officer was down. Caesar preserves the names because he understood what kind of currency he was spending. Among the dead at Pharsalus was a centurion of the 10th Legion named Crastinus, a primus pilus who had retired and then re-enlisted to fight one more campaign at his old commander's side. Before the charge, Crastinus turned to the men of his old century and said, according to Caesar, that today he would earn his general's thanks, living or dead. He took 120 volunteers with him into the gap between the lines and went in first. He was killed by a sword thrust to the mouth. Caesar searched the field for his body afterward. He found it where the fighting had been thickest, the wound still wet, and gave Crastinus a separate burial mound at the edge of the plain. The lesson sent down from the eagle was clear in any language. Your life belongs to the legion. You will stand in the gap. You will die well, so the men behind you have something to remember. Your corpse becomes one more stone in the foundation of Rome. The centurion was clamped in a vice with the enemy on one side and his own men on the other. In front of him, the barbarian war captains had marked the crest. Every Germanic warrior earning glory by single combat. Every Parthian noble looking to display a Roman head on a saddle horn. Every Dacian falxman swinging that long curved blade designed specifically to hook over the rim of a scutum and split open the skull behind it. They all wanted the man with the sideways plume. The Falks terrified the legions of Trajan so badly during the Dacian Wars of AD 101 to 106 that the army began issuing reinforced crossbraces on every helmet, iron bars riveted over the crown. And Trajan's column in Rome shows the modification clearly carved in stone. The braces were not for legionaries. They were for the men in front. Behind him stood the soldiers he had flogged that morning. A javelin thrown from inside one's own ranks in the confusion of a charge left no signature. A knife slid under the lower edge of a cuirass on a fog-thick night march along the Lipa could be blamed on a Cherushi scout. Soldiers who had been beaten until they hated the smell of a particular man's sweat knew that the chaos of battle was the one moment when accounts could be settled and no investigation would follow. The mutiny in Pannonia in AD 14, the same revolt where Lucilius died with his nickname on the soldiers' lips, gives us the pattern in detail. Tacitus describes it in the first book of the Annals. The legions on the Danube, the 8th based at Poetovio, the 9th at Siscia, the 15th Apollinaris at Carnuntum, heard the news of Augustus's death and decided their grievances would be answered now or never. They had been kept in service past the legal 20 years, some for 30 or more. They had been paid in marshland near the river instead of the rich farms of Italy. They had been beaten daily for 2 decades. The commander on the Danube was Junius Blasus, uncle of the Praetorian prefect Sejanus. He had granted the legions a brief holiday to mourn the dead emperor. The holiday turned into a strike. The strike turned into riot when Persenius, a former actor with a voice trained for theater, climbed onto a pile of turf in the camp at Nauportus and asked the men why they earned 10 asses a day while a Praetorian guard in Rome earned 2 denarii to lounge in a wine shop. Before they sent any envoy to Tiberius, before they elected any representative, before they raised any demand, they did something else first. They hunted their centurions. Tacitus names one of them, Aufidianus Rufus, a former camp prefect, a man who had risen through the ranks and become famous in the legion for the volume of work he could extract from a soldier and the volume of beatings he was willing to deliver. The mutineers seized him in his tent. They dragged him before the assembled cohorts. They flogged him with rods, the same rods he had used on them, and shouted into his face, asking him how the wood felt now. Then they loaded him like a pack mule. Tools, stakes, 2 heavy yokes of supplies on his shoulders, the standard load for a legionary on the march toward enemy country, and they marched him at the head of the column under the weight of a full soldier's burden, taunting him at every step with their old refrain about hard work and good discipline, until his knees buckled in the mud and he could not stand. They left him there. Other centurions in the same mutiny were stabbed in their tents, thrown into the latrines to drown in the camp's own filth, or beaten until their faces could not be identified, and then rolled into the Danube. The mutiny on the Rhine, breaking out the same week among the 4 legions under Aulus Caecina at Vetera and Ara Ubiorum, was worse. Tacitus records that the soldiers there killed centurions in a ritual that took the night. The men they hated most were dragged out one by one. Each was made to take 60 lashes, 1 for each centurion in the legion, and then thrown over the ramparts still breathing. Germanicus, arriving days later to restore order, walked through a camp where the bodies were still being pulled from the ditch. This was the second face of his life. The enemy in front, who wanted his helmet as a trophy. The soldiers behind who wanted his throat as payment. And the system added a third weight on top of those 2. Paperwork. The centurion was not only a fighter and a torturer, he was an accountant. Every man in his century, 80 soldiers, was his responsibility down to the buckle on his belt. Vegetius and the Egyptian papyri from Legio III Cyrenaica, stationed at Nicopolis, preserve the routine in handwriting that survives on torn brown sheets in the Berlin and London collections. Daily strength reports listing each man as present, on detached duty, on guard, in hospital, or dead. Weekly equipment inspections. Pay records in Roman denarii broken down by deduction, for rations, for the burial club, for replacement of a worn tunic, for boots, for fodder, if the man had a mule on the company line, for the company standards silver. A pilum lost on the march was charged back to its owner, and the bookkeeping fell on the centurion. A sword found rusted at inspection was the centurion's fault. A discrepancy of a single denarius in the company chest at the end of the month was the centurion's signature next to the loss. A tribune from a senatorial family, perhaps 23 years old, on the first rung of a career that would take him to a praetorship in Rome, could ride in at any hour and demand to see the books. He had been taught rhetoric and Greek poetry in a villa on the Bay of Naples. He had never dug a latrine in his life, but his signature outranked 30 years of scars, and his displeasure could end a career. The penalties for an administrative slip were not symbolic. Frontinus, writing his Stratagemata under Domitian, preserves examples. A public reprimand in front of the cohort. A fine large enough to swallow a year of the higher pay he had bled to earn. Flogging at the standard with the soldiers watching. The order to stand outside the camp at attention in a tunic with no belt. Stripped of the cingulum that marked him as a soldier. A humiliation that hit harder than the lashes. And in the worst cases, reduction in rank. Sent back into the ranks to take orders from the men he had been beating the week before, and to sleep among them with the certain knowledge that not all of them would forgive. His day had no edges. He woke before the dawn watch trumpet, the buzzina, sounded across the camp. He inspected sentries. He oversaw the distribution of the morning grain ration, 3 pounds of wheat per man, ground in hand mills the soldiers carried in their packs. He stood over the drills in the Campus Martius outside the rampart. At the head of work parties, he dug the night camp's ditch. Fossa, 10 Roman feet wide and 7 deep, was the standard for a legion in hostile country, and supervised the planting of the palisade stakes each soldier carried strapped to his pack. He was the first man over the wall in an assault. He was the last man through the gate when a retreat sounded. He settled the fist fights in his century. He read aloud the letters from home for soldiers who could not read, and wrote replies in his own hand for those who could not write. The Vindolanda tablets from the fort near Hadrian's Wall preserved dozens of these scraps of ink on birch wood, requests for socks and underwear from frozen soldiers on the British frontier, complaints about beer rations, invitations to birthday parties. Behind each note somewhere, a centurion's signature. He visited the camp hospital, the valetudinarium, with its rows of small rooms opening off a corridor, and counted the sick. He kept the burial club money in a locked chest under his cot. The club existed because every legionary paid in monthly, so that if he died on campaign, the surviving members would purchase his cremation and a small marker. The centurion was the treasurer, and he carried, always, the awareness that any one of 1,000 things could end him. A Marcomanni spear through the gap in his cuirass, a Parthian arrow through the throat at long range. Plutarch records that at Carrhae in 53 BC, the arrows came down so thick that the front-rank centurions of Crassus's legions were pinned to the ground through their feet. A blade in the ribs from a man in his own century who had decided this was the night. A clerk in the tabularium back on the Palatine Hill in Rome, never having seen a frontier, finding an error in a return filed 3 years before. The higher pay was real, By the reign of Domitian, a centurion of the lower ranks drew roughly 15 times the wage of a common legionary, about 15,000 sesterces a year against 900. And the primus pilus drew 60 times that wage and walked away on retirement with enough silver to enter the equestrian order. Some of these retired first spears went on to become camp prefects, procurators of small provinces, even prefects of Egypt, the post that gave a former centurion command over the granaries that fed the city of Rome. But the pay was not a reward. It was the price of a job no sane man would have accepted at any lower number. It was hazard pay. The hazard was that the pay would be collected by his widow. For those of you who want to see how deep this rabbit hole goes, the book that anchored today's investigation is on the shelf below this video right now. Tap the View Products button on your screen and bring it into your collection. It is not a casual read. It is the source material this story was built from, the kind of book that changes how you look at every Roman ruin you ever see again. Beside it, I have placed a small set of curated relics, artifacts, and pieces tied to the world you are watching tonight. I will not describe them here. Open the shelf and see for yourself, while the story keeps moving. He was the linchpin of the entire war machine, the single gear that translated the will of an emperor in a marble palace on the Palatine into the thrust of a gladius into a Dacian's belly on the Carpathian frontier. He was the conversion point between politics and meat. But a gear is designed to wear out. The men who built the system had already accepted that fact and budgeted for it. Every season, the legions sent fresh names up from the ranks to be fitted with the sideways crest and pushed into the right end of the line. Because the previous year's centurions were already in the ground beneath a stone slab carved with the abbreviation Miel, miles, soldier, and a number that no civilian back home would ever recognize. The system did not love him. The system loved the office, and the office was hungry. And what waited for him next was worse than any battlefield Caesar had described. Because Rome had one final use for a man, it had already broken. An assignment in a country where the eagles had no business flying, against an enemy the legions did not understand, on ground that swallowed armor and rusted iron in a single winter. It was there, in mud the maps barely named, that the centurion would learn the last and cruelest meaning of his rank. And the disaster that taught Rome this lesson would cost an emperor his sleep for the rest of his life. The famous stories of the great centurions, read against the machinery we have just laid bare, stop being tales of glory. They become autopsies, clinical reports on men trapped inside a structure that offered them only one acceptable exit, a death loud enough to be written down. Take the two centurion Caesar names with admiration in the 5th book of the Gallic War, Titus Pullo and Lucius Vorenus. The winter of 54 BC. Quintus Cicero, younger brother of the orator, holds a fortified camp in the territory of the Nervi in northern Gaul, somewhere in the country between the Sambre and the Scheldt. The Nervi, the same tribe that had nearly destroyed Caesar's army at the river Sabus 2 years before, have surrounded the camp with siege works copied from what they had seen the Romans build. Caesar notes the detail with grudging respect. The Gauls have dug a fossa and raised a vallum 9 feet high. They have learned in 2 years what took Rome 2 centuries. They are throwing red-hot clay sling bullets over the rampart, setting the thatched winter huts inside the camp on fire. The garrison numbers fewer than 5,000 men. Of those, more than a tenth are already wounded. The legate Quintus Cicero is sick with a fever, dictating dispatches from a cot, scrawled in Greek so that if the messengers are caught, the Gauls cannot read them. He has been sending runners to Caesar for 10 days. None have come back. Inside the burning camp, two centurions are arguing about which of them deserves promotion. Caesar tells the scene plainly. Vorenus turns to Pullo and asks why he hesitates. What better moment is he waiting for? Pullo answers by climbing the palisade, jumping down on the enemy's side, and running into the densest knot of nervi he can find. He throws his pilum. He hits a man through the shield and the body behind it. The nervi close on him. A spear catches him in the belt, where the leather apron of plates meets the cuirass. The point bends his belt buckle into his hip. His sword arm goes numb. Vorenus watches all of this from the rampart. Then he jumps the wall too. He sprints across the open ground, draws blade against the warriors swarming his rival, kills one of them, drives the rest back a few steps. The ground there is uneven, churned to mud by the siege and the November rain. Vorenus slips. He goes down on one knee. Pullo, already half bleeding out, drags himself across the field to cover him. A nervy noble with a torque around his neck, perhaps a man of the warrior class that Caesar elsewhere calls the soldiery, stands over Vorenus with a long sword raised. Pullo throws his last pilum from the ground. The point catches the noble under the arm. Together, soaked in their own blood and the blood of the men they have killed, the two centurions fight their way back to the gate. Caesar offers this story as a portrait of Roman valor. Read it again. It is a portrait of two men who have run out of reasons to live carefully. Their rivalry was not the rivalry of healthy ambition. It was the only register of self-worth left to men who had been stripped of every other identity. They could not be friends with the soldiers they had to flog at dawn. They could not be peers of the senatorial tribune above them who had never broken a sweat in armor. They were centurions. The only language they had left was the body count. The only proof of existence available to them was the willingness to do something no thinking soldier would do. They went over the wall because going over the wall was the only thing that still felt like being alive. The system had hollowed them out and left them one ritual. Cicero himself, writing later to his brother Quintus from Rome, would mention the siege in passing. The relief column led by Caesar in person arrived after a 50-mile forced march. The nervi broke when they saw the eagles of two fresh legions appearing on the horizon, and Quintus walked out to meet his brother's commander with his hair gone half white in 20 days. Quintus survived. Most of his centurions did not. The official tally Caesar gives is that 9 in 10 of the men under arms at the start of the siege had been wounded by the end. Among the officers, the number was closer to 10 in 10. The same pattern, harder and clearer, in the story of Crestinus at Pharsalus, 9th of August, 48 BC. We met him already. We return to him now to see what his death meant. Crestinus had served out his 20 years. He had been a primus pilus of the 10th Legion, Caesar's favorite, the legion that had broken the Helvetii at Bibracte and the Belgae at the Sabis and the Pompeian cavalry at Munda. He had retired with his pension, a discharge bonus of roughly 12,000 sesterces by the rates Augustus would later formalize, enough to buy a small farm with vineyards. He came back. The morning of the battle, before the trumpets sounded, Caesar rode along the front of his line on the dry stubble of the Thessalian plain, looking for the spot where the fighting would be heaviest. The Anipius River ran low to his right, August sun already burning the grass on the banks brown. Across the plain stood Pompey's army, 45,000 Italians, Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, with 7,000 cavalry on the wing under the command of young Titus Labienus, Caesar's old lieutenant, who had defected at the start of the war. Crestinus was already in his place at the right end of the cohort, his crest sideways, his greaves polished, 120 old men of the 10th around him. all volunteers, all veterans of his old century, all men who had marched out of retirement to follow him into one more line. Plutarch, in his Life of Caesar, names the unit the evocati, the recalled, and notes that they wore no decorations since they were not enrolled for pay but for one final purpose. Crastinus shouted across the field. Caesar records the exact words in the third book of his Civil War commentary. "Today, General, I will earn your thanks, living or dead." This is not bravado. Bravado is for young men. This is a man telling his commander that the contract has been understood and signed. He knows what the right end of the line is for. He knows he is the bait that opens the slaughter. He is telling Caesar, in a sentence short enough to carry over the dust, that he has accepted it. Then he turned to the 120 behind him. "Follow me," he said, "you who were my comrades, and give our general the service we have all sworn to give. This is the last battle. When it is done, he will have his standing back, and we will have our freedom." He charged, alone in front. The 120 followed at a run. They struck Pompey's line before any other cohort had closed the distance. A single wedge of gray-bearded men driving into a wall of fresh Italian recruits levied the previous winter. Pompey had ordered his front rank to receive the charge standing in place, rather than countercharging, a maneuver his generals had argued against, since it gave away the momentum of the impact. Crastinus exploited the standing line. The wedge of evocati split it open. The legions of the 10th poured through behind them. On the far wing, Caesar's hidden fourth line of cohorts rose from concealment and broke Labienus's cavalry against itself. The battle was decided by midday. When it was won, and the dust settled, and the screaming of wounded horses faded into the evening, Caesar walked the field. He found Crastinus's body, where the press had been thickest. The wound was not in the chest or the throat. A Pompeian sword had gone in through Crastinus's open mouth, still shouting, perhaps still calling out the names of the men of the 10th, and come out at the back of his neck. Caesar gave him a separate burial mound at the edge of the plain. The decoration he awarded the corpse was the highest available, the corona civica, or its equivalent, and he paid for the funeral games from his own purse. A general who had spent decades watching his centurions die had finally found one whose death he could not pass over in a casualty list. Crastinus had performed the office to its mathematical limit. He had been used exactly as designed. The centurion's path had only one logical end: not a long life, a useful death. Marcus Petronius shows us the same equation in its purest form. The siege of Gergovia, in the summer of 52 BC, in the country of the Arverni in central Gaul, on a steep volcanic hilltop that the modern map labels Merdogne south of Clermont-Ferrand. Caesar tells the story in the 7th book of the Gallic War. The hilltop sat 1,300 feet above the plain, ringed by walls of volcanic basalt and inner palisades of oak. The Arverni inside were led by Vercingetorix in person, the young chieftain who had united most of Gaul against Rome. Caesar's siege had stalled. He had ordered a limited assault on the lower walls. The trumpets gave the signal to disengage. In the chaos of the slope, the 8th Legion did not hear the recall. Petronius, a centurion of the 8th, led his cohort up the slope and through a gap in the outer wall of the oppidum. The Arverni inside, alerted, swarmed them. The slope behind was too steep to retreat down in formation. The cohort was cut to pieces in the lanes between the wooden huts. Petronius took a spear thrust in the thigh. A second one opened his side below the lowest rib. He could no longer stand without leaning on his shield. He looked at the men around him. They were still trying to protect him. They were not running because their centurion was wounded, and Roman soldiers did not abandon a wounded centurion. He understood what was happening. They were going to die in a circle around him out of a loyalty he himself had beaten into them. Caesar preserves what he said next. "I cannot save myself and you both, but I can save you. I led you into this danger chasing my own glory. Take the chance and get out." Then he stood up on a leg that no longer obeyed him, hefted his sword, and charged the densest part of the Arverni line alone. He killed 2 men with the gladius before the spears reached him. While the Gauls were busy hacking him down, his soldiers broke through the other side and ran. He fought his way to the gate they had come through. He held the threshold long enough for the survivors of his cohort to slip past him. He said one last thing as the men passed under his arm. "I held this gate so you could escape. Now go." Then he closed his eyes and died. Caesar lost 46 centurions on the slope of Gergovia that afternoon. The total Roman dead numbered around 700. Centurions, again, dying at a rate 10 times their share of the army. The number is the same ratio as Pharsalus 4 years later. It was the standard tariff for the rank. This was not heroism in the simple sense the word usually carries. It was the only honest reconciliation available to him. He had been made into a man his soldiers could not love. He had been required, every day, to be the thing they feared. The only way left to settle the account was to spend his body in their place. He could not live among them as a brother, so he died for them as their commander. That was the resolution the system had engineered. Make him their tormentor in the camp. Then arrange the battlefield so that his only escape from being hated was to die saving them. Either way, the legion got the use it needed out of the meat. This was the engine room of the empire. The boundary of Rome from the Solway Firth to the Euphrates was not held in place by emperors making speeches from the rostra in the Forum. It was not held by senators in togas voting in the Curia Julia. It was not even held by the famous generals, the Agricolas in Britain, the Corbulos in Armenia, the Trajans on the Danube, whose names survive in the histories. It was held by men in sideways crests, standing on the right end of the line, with vine sticks in their fists and the names of their dead on their lips. A handful of them rose past the office. The first spear of a legion who survived his term received automatic admission into the equestrian order, the second rank of Roman society, the class from which procurators and prefects were drawn. Suetonius records that under the Emperor Otho, in the brief civil war of AD 69, a former primus pilus named Marius Celsus was made consul. The gravestones from the legionary cemeteries at Mainz and Bonn and Lambaesis preserve dozens of similar careers in cut letters. Tiberius Claudius Maximus, the cavalryman who hunted down Decebalus of Dacia and brought back his head to Trajan, ended his career as a decurion of veterans on a small estate in Macedonia and paid for his own tombstone. He had done well. He was one of the few who did. The rest are nameless. Their bones lie under the soil of every frontier Rome ever held, from the fort at Inchtoutel in Scotland, abandoned in haste in AD 87, to the legionary base at Dura Europos, on the Euphrates, overrun by the Sasanians in AD 256. The legionary cemeteries excavated in the last century have produced rows of standard markers. Abbreviation MIL after a name, a rank, a number of years served. The men under those stones built the empire by being spent. The legion took its best soldiers, men of nerve, men of patience, men who could read other men. It pulled them out of the ranks and ran them through a process designed to strip away every part of a human being that does not serve the cohort. Friendship, sleep, trust, empathy, hope of a long retirement. The process did not produce officers in the modern sense. It produced fuel. Then it painted the crest on their helmets and stood them where the enemy could find them. Then, when the body came back on a shield, or did not come back at all, the legion turned to the next promising optio in the next century and began the same process again, because the supply of ranks was endless and the demand for crests was constant. They were the sinews of the war machine. They were also the part the machine was built to consume. When the empire finally broke down in the late 3rd and 4th centuries, when the field armies under Diocletian and Constantine were reorganized around new ranks, the Campidoctores and Protectores and Ducanari, and the old title of Centurio quietly disappeared from the rolls. No one mourned the office. The name survived in church language as a translation of a Greek military rank in the Gospels, attached to the man at the foot of the cross at Golgotha. The actual weight of the job, the vites, the right end of the line, the helmet painted for the enemy, was buried with the men who had carried it. So we come back to where we began. A veteran on a parade ground, 10 years of Germania and Syria behind him. Cheers around him that sound like dirt hitting a coffin lid. The legate steps forward. The vine stick passes into his hand. Now you can read his face. He is not refusing honor. He is not afraid of the work. He is mourning the man he was a moment ago. He knows what the wood in his hand means. He knows the fire he will sit at tonight will go silent when he approaches. He knows the friends he had this morning are subjects now. He knows the helmet they will issue him in the armorer's tent has a crest fitted sideways for a reason that has nothing to do with parade. He knows the right end of the line. He takes the stick anyway. He has no choice. In Rome's legions, the heaviest sentences always arrived dressed as promotions. He closes his fist around the vites. The grain of the wood is smooth where older hands have worn it. He turns toward his century. 80 faces look back at him, and not one of them is a friend anymore. He begins his march. Somewhere on a frontier he has not yet seen. A riverbank in Germania, a stone fort in Numidia, a pass in the Carpathians where the Falks will be waiting. A piece of ground has already been chosen for him. He does not know its name. He will reach it. He will stand on it. He will die on it. And the eagle will fly on. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it sat with you, if it made you see the silvered helmet differently than you did an hour ago, leave a comment with the city and country you are watching from, subscribe to Ancestral, and send this video to one person who deserves to know what the legends are made of. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. A new investigation is appearing on your screen right now. Another buried chapter waiting to be opened. Click it. Keep walking with us into the dark.